If you vote for the British Labour Party, then you are not a socialist. It really is as simple as that. If you support Keir Starmer, then you are just as bad as any Conservative. In fact, you favour the same things: Thatcherite capitalism at home and imperialism abroad. Now, the sad truth is that the British Labour Party's history is nothing to be proud of, especially when it comes to imperialism. In fact, when it has come to foreign policy, Labour has proven to be a mere servant of British capital and the British state. When the Irish socialist James Connolly led a rebellion against British rule in 1916, the Labour Party sided with the British establishment. When Connolly was captured and executed, Labour MPs applauded in the House of Commons. When the people of Malaya were fighting for independence from British rule in the 1940s and 50s, the Labour government of Clement Attlee supported the crushing of that uprising and used Agent Orange to quell them. That Labour government also played a massive role in the creation of NATO, an anti-communist alliance designed to encircle the Soviet Union and its allied socialist states. So right after the war, Labour, a so-called Democratic Socialist Party, decided to form a hostile stance towards the Soviet Union, the state that suffered the most out of the Second World War. Despicable. And then there is Attlee's attack on Iranian independence. When Iran nationalized its oil industry, the British imposed a blockade on Iranian oil sales, which had devastating social consequences. Apparently Attlee, who was conducting his own campaign of nationalization in Britain, believed that oil in Iran actually belonged to Britain, which is appalling. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Harold Wilson's Labour government supported the 1965 mass killings in Indonesia, where between 500,000 and 3 million unarmed communist supporters were massacred by the Indonesian military. So the Labour government of Harold Wilson backed the hard-right, pro-US General Suharto over unarmed leftists. Now, from these examples alone, you can see that Labour's foreign policy was typically British, designed to further British imperial interests around the world. So the British Labour Party was not a friend of international socialism, but its great enemy. Now we come to Blair, perhaps the worst of the lot. Blair was so hungry for war in Iraq that they produced this dossier which falsely claimed that Saddam Hussein's government could launch a weapon of mass destruction within 45 minutes. As we now know, this was a total lie, because Saddam Hussein's government did not have such weapons, and the dossier has now been discredited. Still, that war resulted in more than 100,000 deaths and millions being displaced. So when it comes to foreign policy, Labour has been a servant of both the British state and British capitalism. They only see their fellow white European social democrats as allies and have treated socialist movements in the global south monstrously. So why, as an opponent of imperialism, would you support them? Now, like many of you, I believe Corbyn was different. Rather than taking after Attlee, Wilson and Blair, Corbyn was a true opponent of Western imperialism, supporting socialist movements in Latin America, Africa, Asia and the Middle East. When it came to economics, he was interested in smashing the Thatcherite consensus, replacing it with a form of social democracy that would encourage co-ops, profit sharing and public ownership. He was basically Attlee without the racism and imperialism. Of course, since Corbyn was clearly not a grovelling servant of the British state, there was a monstrous media campaign against him which played a large role in him losing the 2019 election. Now, there is a myth that Corbyn lost that election because working class people despised him. This is not true at all. If only working-aged people voted, Labour would have won the election. It was the pensioners who overwhelmingly voted Tory, those unaffected by the gig economy and Tory workplace policies. Basically, the generation that failed to stand up against Thatcher in the 1980s. Those who allowed their industries to be destroyed and workers' rights to be fundamentally weakened. Now, this might upset some people, but you know it's true. That generation failed. And they failed again in 2019 when many of them voted Tory for the first time to get Brexit done. My respect for them is zero. To continue, so after Corbyn lost the last election, he decided to not stand as leader again. A leadership contest took place, which was won by Sir Keir Starmer. During his leadership campaign, Starmer claimed that he would basically be a more professional Corbynite, adopting policies such as renationalising utilities and introducing a Green New Deal. In fact, during the leadership campaign, Starmer praised Corbyn repeatedly. He even honoured him in his victory speech.
I want to pay tribute to Jeremy Corbyn, who led our party through some really difficult times, who energised our movement, and who's a friend as well as a colleague.
Fast forward till now. Corbyn is now suspended from the Labour Party. Starmer has broken all his pledges, and Blairites now dominate the party again. Rachel Reeves is now in charge of economic policy, someone who thinks it's alright to demonise the poorest in society. Labour is not even committed to the NHS anymore, a healthcare system that has already been extensively privatised. Naturally, the unions have started withdrawing money from this despicable party, which is a good thing. This party does not deserve a cent of working people's money. Now let's talk about Starmer's vile treatment of Jeremy Corbyn. There was recently news that they are already seeking to replace him in his seat of Islington, a seat that Corbyn has represented for almost 40 years. Why? Because Corbyn said claims of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party were dramatically overstated for political reasons. A statement of fact. For example, Simon Heffer, a so-called journalist, claimed that Corbyn wanted to reopen the Nazi death camp of Auschwitz, an appalling and disgusting claim. Corbyn did not take any policy to the election that would have discriminated against any minority. The Tories did, see their anti-gypsy policies, which of course were completely ignored by the vile British media. By the way, this is what Starmer said about the attacks on Corbyn during his leadership campaign.
Well, look, the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn in that election we've just had were terrible, and they came back at us on the doors. They vilified him, and they knew what they were doing, and they knew why they were doing it.
Now we can conclude that Starmer was lying in this speech. He clearly thought the vile attacks on Corbyn were justified because it suited his faction's political purposes. Starmer is a pathological liar with zero integrity. Also, do not believe that Starmer gives a damn about Jews. According to Jewish Voice for Labour, Jews are almost 5 times more likely to face anti-Semitism charges than non-Jewish members. That's right, under Starmer, Jews are far more likely to be kicked out of Labour for anti-Semitism than non-Jews are. This should point to 2 things. First, many Jews stood with Jeremy Corbyn. Anyone who blames Jewish people for Corbyn's defeat is a disgrace and should be condemned. The second thing is that Starmer clearly does not like left-wing Jews who express support for Palestine. Now I think Starmer is clearly a massive anti-Palestinian racist. In a recent speech, for example, he stated that Israel made the desert flower, a grave insult to the people who were living there before the creation of Israel, especially those who lost their homes in the Nakba. Imagine if someone said that the British made Australia bloom. Would that not be a grave insult to the indigenous people living there? So it is quite easy to conclude that Starmer is not only a pathological liar, but also a sickening bigot. Also, Starmer's idea of internationalism is supporting NATO and condemning movements such as Stop the War. Indeed, Starmer has used the current war in the Ukraine to attack the left of his party, threatening to suspend MPs for signing a document that criticised NATO's eastward expansion. So Starmer is not only a liar and a bigot, but also a vile authoritarian as well. Now I ask, would any self-respecting socialist support such a party? The answer is clearly no. If this version of Labour is allowed to win, it would vindicate the Blairites who should have been banished decades ago. Every effort should be made to stop Starmer from coming to power. He would be a disaster and a disgrace. Hopefully Corbyn, who is no longer in Labour, decides to form his own party to act as a spoiler for Starmer's vile gain. Unlike the leaders of the numerous tiny socialist parties in Britain, Corbyn actually has a high profile, which would be a massive help. Of course, it would take many years for the party to be ready for government, but it could in the beginning smash Starmer's dream of becoming Prime Minister, which is a good thing. Starmer is totally unfit to be PM. Now if you choose to vote Labour, even though Starmer has proven himself to be a bigoted, authoritarian liar, then you are no socialist. Just a clown who wants the Conservative B-team in charge rather than real, genuine change.